Welcome to Ask the Farmer, focused on winterizing your garden. And we have Farmer Fern here answering questions both from the participants who are here and then some other questions that I've gathered from others who couldn't make it today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mara. So I think it is best if we start with the questions for the individuals who are here today, and we can kind of get through those. And then, like Mara said, we can kind of go through some of the more general questions that we've been getting maybe on repeat over at Boundless Landscapes. So to start, do either of you lovely individuals have a question about winterizing your garden, winter planting, really anything at all?
I have a question. So I was planning on making the cardboard sandwich compost delight, and but what about the strawberries? They're still looking so good. Do you just put the cardboard on top of it, or do you just let them stay out and try to thrive through?
Really great question. Really great question. So anything that you're hoping, well, so I just want to mention, so what we're talking about is something that's sometimes known as what would it be? Sheet compost, lasagna composting. And so basically it's a process of putting down some sort of weed barrier and then putting some organic matter on top, hopefully something that's carbon-based and nitrogen-based, sort of stacking them in a layer so they decompose in place. So when sheet mulching, it's important to remember that this brown cardboard, this biodegradable cardboard, is going to take at least a year, most likely, to decompose in most environments. And so anything that you're hoping to have come back next year, be it a perennial, a bulb, you know, if you have like hidden tulips or somewhere in there, if you are scattering seeds for a cover crop and you're hoping to have them come back, then it's best to not cover them with cardboard, right? So this is sort of an impenetrable layer for around a year. And as it's decomposing, you know, it's serving a lot of benefits. It's feeding earthworms, it's retaining moisture, it's providing a weed barrier. So anything underneath it most likely will not be growing through it for about a year, okay? And so if you have, let's say you have a really weedy garden bed and you have a couple, let's use blackberries as an example, you can put the cardboard down around the base of the blackberries to serve as that weed barrier, and then put some compost or some mulch on top, and then leave where the actual blackberry is uncovered, or leave where the strawberry is uncovered, so that it can come back next year. You are able to go ahead and apply a mulch, such as compost or wood chips or straw, directly on top of those strawberries on their crown. They are able to grow through that, but they won't be able to grow through that cardboard barrier for at least a year.
So just so I'm clear, the cardboard barrier is just for the places where maybe I had lettuces or whatnot. It's not for things that I'm expecting to come up again.
That's a great question. So the cardboard barrier, the best application for it is somewhere where you are going to be putting 6 to 8 inches of some sort of organic matter on top of it. So if you are wanting to sheet mulch, there are ways or the areas where I would elect to sheet mulch versus just a normal mulch, you know, 2 inches of wood chips. The areas where I would elect to sheet mulch would be maybe a garden bed if I have an excess of compost and I can go ahead and apply it. Or if I have a very weedy garden bed, let's say you're trying to convert a plot of lawn to a garden bed, then that's another great option. Oh, Mara, someone else is trying to join. Welcome, welcome. So in that case, that would be suppressing that lawn, right? The lawn would be unable to go through that sheet mulch. And then if you've struggled with your garden, let's say you have an in-ground plot and you have struggled with garden fertility, things aren't growing quickly, they sort of tap out, you know, partway through the summer, maybe the soil is really heavy in clay and the roots are having a hard time working through it. Sheet mulching is a great way to build topsoil, but it does require and to build fertility, but it does require quite a bit of material. You know, it does require a nice mixture of both carbon, something like wood chips or straw, and then nitrogen, something like compost that you're putting on there. Is that
so just listen. It's just that just two pretty simple ones. I have that beautiful kale, and I don't know do anything about it and just leave it or put mulch around it or cut it or like what to do with the kale. And then my second question would be, like, I seeded that spinach that never came. And I actually reseeded it. It's also like still didn't come. So I don't like, can I still like, I will buy the seeds somewhere else. Like it might have been something wrong with the seeds that I had. But is it too late to try again a third time? And how to do it now that it's colder, but it can't water that much? What could I do? Because I want to use that area in my farming box if I still can.
Of course. So I'd be happy to talk about that. So let's touch on the kale plants first. And I just want to say, welcome, Maggie.
And can I chime in for 1 second? Maggie, I just wanted to explain the format. So basically, people are just throwing out their questions. We have a small group here live on the Zoom call, and then we've been gathering questions from other folks.
Great.
We are recording this, so if for any reason you would prefer not to be on video, you can also turn your video off, so that if you'd rather that not be the case. So just wanted to give you a heads up about that. And so after Vera has a turn, you're welcome to bring a question up as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's helpful.
Okay, go ahead, Fern.
All right, wonderful. So let's talk about the kale plants. So I just want to clarify that these are mature kale plants. All right, so this is not a baby kale that Vera is talking about. These are kale plants that Vera's been harvesting from throughout the summertime. So they are well established. You know, at this point, they have great deep root systems. And Vera's working with raised beds. And I believe this is your first year growing in these raised beds. Is that correct? So it most likely has a stellar root system, because the first year you're growing in raised beds, that soil is not compacted. It's nice and loamy, and roots have a really easy time making their way down through it. So these are nice hardy kale plants. And Vera, what you really have there is a recipe for success for growing kale throughout the winter months. So the deeper those roots are, the more mature your kale plants are, then the higher chance that you have that those kale will overwinter, meaning that they will grow when they can in the wintertime, and that you can keep harvesting from them, and that they may do something sort of similar to perennializing, where you will still be able to most likely harvest from them next spring. Now, there are certain types of kale, certain varieties of kale that are more prone to winterizing or more prone to perennializing, and this is because they're hardier, right? They're more frost tolerant.
Right.
The more mature your kale plant is, the better, set you are for success. If you were to have baby kale, it has really shallow roots, let's say, right? Well, when that top 2 inches of soil freezes solid in December, then those roots are also freezing solid. But because your plants probably have these roots really far down in your garden bed, they've got this great insulation, they're near the house. So there are a lot of things that are going for this kale that would help insulate it from the cold winter temperatures. Now, important things to note when you are harvesting from something in the wintertime is that it's going to be very different from harvesting in the summer, in the sense that your plant will be growing much slower, right? It's going to be growing slower due to the lack of sunlight, for one reason. It's also going to be growing slower due to the temperatures. And so these are things to expect, right? You won't be harvesting perhaps weekly from these plants. But what I will say is, by keeping those kale plants in the ground and harvesting them throughout the winter time, you're in for a real treat, because the colder the temperature, the sweeter the kale. These colder temperatures just do something so wonderful to brassicas. Brassicas are cruciferous vegetables, so broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. These crops really love the cool temperatures, and they are sweeter when you harvest them for that reason. If you've ever had kale in the peak of August from your garden, and it might be a little bit bitter tasting, right? And maybe a little bit woody in texture. That's just because kale doesn't like heat. They're really not good friends. But kale and cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, these are friends to fall growers, spring growers. And if you're lucky, they'll make it all the way through the winter time in somewhere like Boulder. So that's what I have to say about your kale plant. I want to see if you have any questions for me about that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. This is good news. Dr. Kale, did you have a response to my question about the spinach?
Absolutely. So I
Thank you.
just want to repeat that question back. So Vera and I met, oh, what was that? Maybe a month ago? Not even?
Yeah, about that, probably. Yeah.
So we met for a garden consultation, and we were touching on winterizing Vera's garden and sort of what I would recommend when it comes to, you know, what to do with the warm season crops, what to do with some of those perennials that she has, perennial herbs, rhubarb, and then what to do when it comes to winter growing in her exact little ecosystem. And she had this patch where she had attempted to seed spinach, which spinach is one of these crops that loves the winter time. It's so sweet. There are certain varieties, my favorite being Bloomsdale, that grow so well in the winter months. And I swear, if you haven't had spinach right after it's been covered in snow, you have to try it. It's just the sweetest, most delicious thing. It's so tender, it almost melts in your mouth. So Vera had attempted to direct seed spinach, which you absolutely can do really from August on, I would say, if your intention is to grow for the winter time. And these seeds, for some reason, did not germinate. Now, Vera, this was a newer seed packet, is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, and I bought them from the Harlequin's garden, so it's surprising that yeah.
So spinach, I should say, it can be finicky. It can be a little bit finicky. You know, it likes certain soil temperatures, all seeds do, for germination. It may have been eaten. That's also something that happens to crops that you attempt to grow in the fall. With the colder temperatures coming, birds, squirrels, bunnies, you name it, they're looking for anything in the soil. I was just walking in my garden right before this, and something had dug up all of my, 3-inch tall pea plants to get to the little pea that they were growing out of. And so these animals are really, in the business of digging in gardens at this time of year, I must say, looking for seeds that they can eat. What else could have happened is a lack of moisture. It does require very even amounts of moisture for germination. And then once this spinach is mature, it needs really well draining soil. So these are things that could have been going against you. I'm guessing that those seeds, I'm guessing we weren't running into an issue with seed viability. Seeds lose viability every year. Your germination rates are going down every year that you store them. And most seeds can last for roughly 3 to 5 years in your, let's say, in your drawer, in your living room, if that's where you're keeping them. And they are still going to be well performing. So since these were new seeds, I'm guessing that they were viable and that we're running into some sort of environmental issue. Now, it's not too late for Vera to get to grow something, right? And so a couple other options for you, if you're looking for something that you can eat, perhaps a salad green, Claytonia is a great option. It's also known as miner's lettuce. It's perhaps the most frost tolerant of the greens that I know of. People in Vermont will grow miner's lettuce throughout the winter months and harvest it. And it's a little bit succulent in texture, which spinach sort of is as well. So Claytonia, Claytonia. Why did I put myself through spelling on this? Mara's laughing at me like she hasn't seen me try to spell things out loud.
we are both in that place, yes.
Yes. So anyway, Claytonia is a great option if you can find the seeds. They are available online, and you can directly seed that right now. You could theoretically directly seed that in a month if you wanted to as well. It's that hardy. Other options, these aren't things you would be eating, but they'd still be good to plant, would be something like winter rye, if no one in your family has celiacs. Another option would be clover. These would be cover cropping options. And, a few other things you could plant would be flower bulbs. If you wanted to plant, tulips or daffodils, let's say. And lastly, you could also plant garlic. Just keep in mind that garlic needs full sun. It needs a lot of nutrients. I think we'll talk a little bit later about how to plant garlic, most likely. It's a pretty common winterizing question I get. And it is not harvested out until middle of June, late June. So just don't plant it where you're hoping to, plant a tomato in May of next year, because the garlic will still be there taking up that garden real estate. Okay. Vera,
Thank you so much.
did that answer it for you?
Yeah, totally. Thank you. It was a great
Of
answer.
course,
Thank
of
you.
course. All right.
Maggie, do you have any burning questions you'd like to bring?
Oh, I have so many.
Good.
Well, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I was looking at the chat. Hold on a second. Burning is what you've already done with Vera, which is the whole setting it up for the winter. I have 2 raised beds and then an area in my patio that's just soil that I've cultivated over a number of years. The raised beds, this is the 2nd season. I have huge amounts of kale. I don't know what kind of, one of the kales I brought down from Aspen. A friend of mine who's an extraordinary gardener said, look, you plant this and you'll have it the rest of your life. And so far that's true. It's kind of a greenish turquoise. It's really a light colored kale and it's incredibly hardy. But I'm just curious, before I get to the season closing stuff, every critter on the planet eats it.
Yes.
I mean, it's just like, it's almost like instead of polka dots, it's holes. Do you have any idea what loves my kale so much?
Oh, Maggie, do I ever. And if I start to turn into a ghost, I apologize. I'll have to shift yours.
Well, I'm sort of like that right now. It's that time of day.
It truly is. You know, it feels kind of nice. I'll take it. I'll take the sunlight. So,
Yes.
Maggie, yes,
Yeah.
kale is so prone to being nibbled on.
Yeah.
And the difficult thing is when kale is nibbled on, when it, something starts to attack the kale plant and someone other than us starts to consume your kale plant. The issue that we run into is almost always aphids. Okay, so they may not be the thing that's doing this initial damage, but they can sense when a plant is weakened. And that's when they really, flock in. So this is something for you to be aware of.
Yeah.
Aphids may lead to the downfall of your plant. Now, aphids really thrive in these warmer months. That's when they're going to be going after your kale.
Yeah.
Part of that is because your kale struggles most in the warmer months.
Yes.
Something for you to be prepared for. So let's talk about first what could be eating your kale. And the list is very long. Like, some really common answers would be if your kale's irrigated or if you're watering frequently, or if there is some sort of mulch or straw or leaf litter around / near the kale, then slugs are absolutely an issue that you may be running into.
I don't have, I've looked because I knew they were a possibility. There are no slugs. I can't find what's eating them. Those white moths are living. They think my garden is theirs.
Yes.
I think they're eating everything.
Well, so those are cabbage loopers or cabbage flies or cabbage moths, which cabbage, kale, all the same essentially.
Yes.
These are non-native, I believe, moths / butterflies that absolutely prey upon the cruciferous vegetables, those brassicas, the broccoli, kale, cabbage.
Yes.
Now, the moths do nibble, okay? So they will be eating some amount from your kale. They are not your #1 threat. It's their caterpillars.
Oh my God, I finally saw one.
Yes, they are neon green.
Yes.
They match the kale. They'll be typically on the underside of the leaf because they are
They shifted even over to the tomatoes by the season end. They're sort of this green and plump, like a Cheshire cat plump. Right?
You are exactly right. You
and not that many legs,
Mm-hmm.
but completely owning that stem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and they can demolish a plant in one night.
Yeah.
They are just very, very hungry creatures. So, and they lay their eggs. I believe they have black eggs. They lay them typically down around the base of the kale, just so you are aware. Now, do a couple organic things to protect your kale.
Yes, that would be great.
So let's talk about this from a systems approach. Anytime you're dealing with any sort of caterpillar, you got to think, well, what eats caterpillars? First, birds. So inviting songbirds into your garden is a great way to naturally combat caterpillars, but this will not single-handedly wipe out cabbage looper problem. So a few other things that we can do, there are certain organic applications. Neem oil would be a very common one. to combat the eggs. And you can apply that directly to your plant, and you can apply that down around the base of your plant.
Ah, interesting.
Another option would be an organic BT spray. And if you were to look this up online, I think most horticulturalists and botanists would recommend a BT application. You're going to want to make sure that you are buying an organic BT. BT is a chemical that is naturally found in the soil, and it does mess with the intestines of the caterpillars, okay? And it specifically targets this sort of animal, all right? So you don't have a risk of killing, let's say, bees or pollinators because of this application. Though, anytime you're applying anything, I always say, you know, use it as modestly as you can, right? So no need to go over and apply it to your tomatoes. If you first and foremost address your kale, and you protect your kale, then that will prevent these creatures from ever really coming back, right? And you're going to kill off this generation of that. So an application of BT, I believe it's called Monterey BT. That's a good organic application, or an organic spray.
What's the name of it? Say it again.
It's BT as in the letters.
Yeah, I started to write BEETN. I thought there's no such thing as BT, so it has to be the letters.
Yes, and I think it's Monterey BT. Mar, if you could look it up and post it, that would be great.
Yeah.
And so that's a caterpillar killer, essentially.
Yeah.
So it's important to not spray that on anything like milkweed or near milkweed, where we may have other caterpillars.
Right.
Now, a few more options would be.
Can I just say one thing? I don't mind sharing, but after a while, it's their plant.
Yes, and it will be, and they will kill the plant, just so you are aware.
And there's not so much to eat.
Absolutely, it will lessen your yields. And then, like I said, it will attract aphids. Now, if it is attracting aphids, then you have a few options. Release of ladybugs is a great way to address the aphid population.
Yeah.
But overall, the best way to really stop these cabbage loopers from happening in the first place, to stop you from having to purchase any of these sprays, the neem oil, the BT, would be to use a row cover. Now, it's not pretty. I'll preface with that. It's not the most beautiful, or it's not the option that is most focused on curb appeal of the garden. A row cover is something that is it's almost like a cloth that's over your garden and protecting it from insects. You know, we're not worried about kale needing to be pollinated unless you're a master.
So it's over the top as opposed to on the ground?
Exactly. So it's over the top, but it touches the ground and the sides. And Mara, could you post a photo of Agrabah?
Yeah.
So Agrabah is perhaps the most common name, also goes by Rime or row cover. And it is a white cloth that floats over your crops. It is absolutely permeable for sunlight and for water. All right. I think it has something like 10% of sunlight, which when you're growing kale in high altitude Boulder in the middle of the summer, cutting out 10% of the sun rays is not a bad thing. It's actually going to help your plant. You're going to have a healthier plant if you're able to.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an interesting thing. Maybe I'm going to dominate this conversation without meaning to, but putting row covers on can also bring pests if you use the wrong stuff. Like that, the stuff you could get like at any of the gardening stores, it's green or brown and has light coming through. But if you roll up the sides, I found that just to let air in, it becomes a home.
Oh, I see. So this is the white cloth.
Not the white cloth, those ones that are more of the synthetic feel, and they're green or brown. But they are light they do allow light in. They're really interesting.
I'm gonna have to look into these. I'm not sure if I'm familiar with these ones. I would recommend using the white. You know, it has a effect.
And where do you find the white? Because I was looking for it and I had a hard time finding it, but so everybody was trying to find it, I think.
It is popular, and you'll see if you drive by any organic farm, they have a good number of their crops are covered in this. I cover everything from lettuce to cabbage to kale, arugula. Oh gosh, what else do I cover? Really anything I'm concerned about pests attacking. That is not
includes tomatoes, actually even tomatoes.
Tomatoes and cucumbers and pole beans. These plants are too tall for me to warrant covering.
Yeah.
The concept of trying to get something 6 feet high, a cloth,
right. Right.
And the other thing is that those crops need pollination, right? So then it's a lot more finicky. You're having to open it and close it to let in pollinators.
Right.
Now, when it comes to kale or arugula, we're not worried about the plant needing to be pollinated in order for us to harvest from it, right? And
Yeah.
so I absolutely recommend Agribon. You can buy it at most garden stores in the springtime. It does sell out quickly. It's available online, and you can buy it in a huge roll by the yards. It's a fabric, so it's very similar to other fabrics. And
Is
this,
that the one that you just put in, Mara? There it is.
so this
Agribon.
really,
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have it at McGuckins in smaller pieces. I also have lots of dirty bits of it. So if
Right.
anyone really wants one, I can grab some and drop it off for you.
it lasts
Okay.
for years, right? You can reuse it. Hail will go through it. So once it's been hailed on or it has any holes in it, then it's no longer effective.
Right.
But it's an absolutely great thing to use. And I will say it is really our last hope against the cabbage loopers from an organic perspective. If you are not wanting to sacrifice quite a bit of your kale plants every year, then, you know, you're most likely going to have to look to a row cover. At this point, they're just so prevalent. If you go outside in the summertime, you're going to see one of those little white guys floating by you, you know.
Well, no, they're I have a very big garden of flowers and they're
yes.
ubiquitous.
Oh, I know it. I know it. So
Yeah.
yes, I would recommend looking into utilizing a row cover to protect your kale. And you can even do that throughout the winter time. They're not as big of a threat in the winter, but you can, you know, do that. They do provide, I believe, 2 degrees of frost protection.
Oh,
Which-
wow. I didn't think of that. That's a great idea.
So we actually put some on the plants today, because, you know, we're sort of on that edge of 28 to 30 degrees, and that might just be enough to save some plants.
Yes.
So did you put it, how high off the ground are you doing it? I mean,
You can, well, I'll let Fern answer. Go ahead.
Oh, so yeah, so it can directly touch the plants if the plants are sturdy enough. If you have low growing plants like lettuce, you can lay it directly on top of them. Just make sure you're securing down around the outside of them so you're not trapping any squirrels or bunnies or anything.
right.
So it's not blowing off of them. You can also use any sort of hooping system. So, you know, I have some nice wire that I bend into hoops and I secure down into the ground. And then I
Good
lay
idea.
the Agribon over that, and then I use lawn staples to secure it down. So I'm almost creating like baby greenhouse high tunnel situation. And so I would recommend that. And I really think for organic home growers, you know, looking into adding row cover into your garden, it's absolutely a great way to prevent, you know, damage from pests that we're not wanting to have to deal with. And it really does cut down on the amount of, you know, sprays that you may have to utilize throughout your growing season.
That'd be worth it alone.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other thing, I have all these questions backed up. So you should tell me anytime when you're ready to shift to the overall, because literally they're just pouring out of my head. Like neem oil. Neem oil, it's interesting because it burns, it will burn the leaves. And I've even put it on early in the morning and late at night. And I see where it was on, where it would actually discolor the leaves.
Oh, what is burning the leaves? I'm sorry.
Neem oil.
Oh, the neem oil. Okay,
Yeah.
so yes. So yes, you do want to be careful applying the neem oil. When the sunlight hits it, it can heat a little bit. And really, you know, it's sticking to your leaves. So this is something you should touch on. Just watering as a whole. Anytime you are watering your garden, if you are getting even a little spot of water, let's imagine it on a cucumber leaf.
Mm-hmm.
What is that water little droplet doing once the sunlight hits it? What's it sort of turn into? It's just a magnifying glass.
Yes.
So yeah, it does lead to burning, and oil sticks around longer than the water does, right? It's not evaporating off. So you just want to be careful. And the other thing I must note about neem oil is, you know, I must say it's probably my favorite use, my favorite chemical to use in the garden. But it is toxic to bees. So you should never apply neem oil to a blossom or anywhere where you have really heavy bee traffic. So never spray your flowers with it. You know, if you're applying it to, let's say, a tomato plant, make sure you're not getting it on those beautiful yellow blossoms. But it is a great, you know, thing to have on hand, both if you have houseplants and then also in your garden to, you know, keep away pests.
Right. Okay.
Can I interject for a moment? We had Jenny just joined us, and Jenny, I know you're in a public space, but do you have a burning winterization question that you would like to pose to Fern? I know you have to hop on and off a little bit.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm just on for a couple minutes. Mine is, and I joined late, so I'm not sure what you guys have already covered. So it's more of just like a general. I did a garden for the first time this summer, and I'm not sure what to do with like my kale plants and my basil plants and my delicata squash and all of that. Like, how do I mean, it's like abundant leaves right now, and I'm just not sure what to do with it at all. I'm like kind of first time garden in my yard.
Of
Sweet.
course.
And Fern, the one thing I'd say before you answer is I feel like there can be a two-part question because people may get off this call and run out to their gardens to do a few things before we hit 28 degrees tonight. And then they'll have to sort of pick up the pieces after we hit 28 degrees. So maybe you can do, it could be a two-part answer about what you could do tonight and what you can do tomorrow.
All right, so let's see what time it is. All right, so what you could do tonight after you've had your dinner, let's talk about warm season versus cold season crops, first of all. Certain crops are warm season crops. They die at 35 to 30 through 32 degrees Celsius. They no longer produce once they've been touched by freeze, by frost. Then there are other crops that really love frost, right? It sweetens them, it makes them healthier. Let's talk about kale, carrots, garlic grows throughout the winter time. So these are frost tolerant cold season crops. We're not too worried about them. And then there are some crops that don't necessarily fit perfectly into either of those categories, lettuce, certain radishes, beets, chard. These crops can take some frost, and it does depend partially on, how cold the soil is, right? Was it a warm afternoon? Was it sunny? That soil's got some ambient heat to it. Are you growing perfectly in the ground? Are you in a patio pot? Are you in a raised bed? So really, how much thermal mass is around this plant? And then also the question of the variety. Certain varieties of crops, like I mentioned, Bloomsdale spinach, are more frost tolerant than other varieties of spinach. So all of these things sort of factor into whether or not these crops are leaning towards being warm season crops or cold season crops. So most home gardeners, when they hit this time of year, their garden is comprised of a mixture of warm season and cold season crops. It's both kale and peppers, right? What to do when we're hitting this sort of temperature that is a frost, but in certain places maybe the soil does have some warmth to it. Maybe your garden's right near your house where it also has some warmth, or near a rock retaining wall that's going to retain some warmth throughout the night. So once you see this 35 to, I would say, 28 degrees, okay, it's time to think about how do we protect these warm season crops if we really want to. If you see that it's going to be 25 tomorrow night, then really there's no real use in running out tonight to try to protect them for one more day of life, okay? But if you are, looking and it's going to be 70 for the rest of the week, and this is just a rogue incident, then I think it's worth it to give it a shot. You're looking at 70. Is that 87?
70.
What?
It's supposed to be 70 this weekend, right? Yes.
This is an interesting frost moment because we're down to 28 tonight, 30 tomorrow, and then we don't dip into freezing again for the next at least week.
All right, so let's do what we can to protect your warm season crops. And just so you know, I'll run through a quick list in my head and you can sort of self-identify which ones are warm season. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, cucumbers, really any squash, including winter squash, summer squash, most cut flowers, but not all cut flowers. These are crops that
Basil.
Basil, thank you. Let's see, basil would fall into that category. Many other herbs are a little bit frost tolerant, cilantro, parsley, and then those Mediterranean herbs like, well, not rosemary, but Mediterranean herbs like oregano, thyme, we're not too concerned about.
Tarragon? What about tarragon?
Tarragon is not as frost tolerant as some of those, but it's not frost tolerant, I believe. So it's one of those sort of middle ground crops. So
yeah,
with these crops that are warm season crops, you can do a few things to try to protect them. The first thing you can do is cover them, like Mara mentioned. And row cover is a great thing. If you do not have row cover, an old bed sheet works great, I will say. Any sort of fabric layer is going to sort of insulate them. Now, if we have snow coming, snow itself is a thermal mass, just so you know. So let it snow on the crops, okay? Odds are that they'll do fine with the snow. The real threat is when there's just a very frigid frost that's not accompanied by snow. So once that happens, you know, go ahead and try to cover your crops. I would say that's the best thing you have going. It's important that this row cover is not touching your crops, if possible. So putting a couple rakes up or shovels that you've sort of put into the ground as stakes to, you know, put the bed sheet over your crops. Those are things that are going to help retain the thermal mass in the earth, right? It's going to help create sort of this warming effect underneath the sheet, and it should help protect these crops that are really, you know, susceptible to dying because of frost. So I would go ahead and try that if you can. Now, crops like lettuce, chard, kale, most salad greens, I should say, you know, and peas, I'm not too concerned that these crops are going to die from this freeze. Root vegetables as well, so beets, radishes, carrots, I'm also not too concerned. And that's because they're in the ground, tucked in with nice thermal mass. Okay, so you don't need to go outside and cover those crops.
Would you suggest, Fern, though, that everyone harvest as much as they can from all of those plants before this frost?
Yes, because let's now talk about what happens tomorrow morning, right? So yes, go ahead and harvest as much as you can off of the plants. Green tomatoes are a delight. If your tomato has no green left on it, all right, so if it's already yellow or already all orange, then go ahead and bring it in and let it ripen on the counter, okay? But if it's just green, then eat it as a fried green tomato, if that's your sort of thing. You know, green peppers, I think they're fine. Go ahead and bring those on in as well. So go ahead and harvest what you can from those plants. And then the most important thing to mention is tomorrow morning when you wake up, if you want to take off the sheet, you can, but do not touch those plants. Don't touch them for days, all right? Give them about 3 days before you're going in there and either ripping them out or harvesting from them or pruning them. And this is because once these crops, both warm season crops and cold season crops, though more for warm season crops, have experienced a freeze, they are just in a very delicate and fragile state. They've just gone through a lot of trauma, and we need to give them a second to breathe and recuperate. And what you may find is that, you know, some parts of your tomato plant, or let's use squash as an example, they may look really bad tomorrow morning, all right? They may look like they sort of melted, but that does not mean the plant is dead. Give it a few days. If it starts to add on more growth, right, with this next sort of warm wave that we have coming, if they bounce back, you know, and they start to sort of look like themselves again, then you're good to go, all right? If after about 3 days they are still melted looking, you know, maybe they're withering and they're black at this time, or, you know, maybe the plant has almost softened to the touch and begun to rot, then at that point you can go ahead and remove your warm season crops, okay? Now, I should touch on how to remove these crops. You can go ahead and uproot them if you feel so called to, for whatever reason. I have a bias that when you're doing that, you're really removing some good soil from your garden, right? Some people would say that's very disruptive to the soil ecosystem. Some people would say that if you don't remove them, they're not going to decompose, or that you can't immediately reseed. I would say leave the roots if you can. If you had a very diseased plant, all right, let's use the example of a tomato that had really severe blight. If you have some sort of disease going on, go ahead and remove those roots, compost that plant somewhere else, all right? Send it to municipal compost rather than putting it in your own compost, where that plant will be thoroughly heated and that disease will die. If you try to put it in your own compost and your compost isn't getting so hot at home, then that disease can really carry on through that compost, unfortunately. Now, if you don't have any diseased plants that you're really worried about, then go ahead, if you can, and go down to the soil level with a good clean pair of snips and some sharp ones if you have them, or even a knife, and go ahead and cut that plant back at soil level. Okay, so I'm imagining your tomato plant, going all the way down to where it's growing out of the earth and cutting it off, right? So you're going to take the top away. You can even lay it down on its side to decompose. Heck, you can even lay it down on its side. Think of all the good carbon and nitrogen in it, and put some compost on top so that it's decomposing in place and returning the nutrients to the garden. That also increases your chance of volunteer tomatoes, because suddenly you have maybe some young tomato seeds that may sprout up next year.
They also add some leaves from their garden on top of it.
Yes, absolutely. So you really can just chop it and drop it, is what some people would say. Or, you know, if you don't want to have a tomato plant decomposing in your garden, you're concerned about insects or rats or the smell or any number of things, that's absolutely fine. But go ahead and leave those roots if you can. They're crucial to the plant's ecosystem. Okay, they are to the soil's ecosystem. They have mycelial networks running through them. They too have nutrients in them, and they provide this wonderful sort of shelter and ecosystem for the earthworms. So leave them for the winter, and they will decompose. You know, insects will snack on them, and then next year, if anything, they've just added some nice fluffiness and organic matter to your soil. Does that make sense for how to remove these warm season crops, you know, if they really did die from a frost? But really, perhaps the number one thing you could take away from tonight is, after any sort of frost, just don't touch your plants. Give them 3 days of looking sort of bad in the front yard before you go ahead and, you know, remove them.
Jenny, does that answer your question a little bit for starters? Oh, I think she might be in transit. I think we should try to do another round where each person can ask you one question. And I think, you know, hopefully within that we can touch on garlic. And I put a link in for where you can locally source garlic if you decide you would like to plant it. And I think Fern can emphasize the pros and cons of planting garlic again, but you can get them at the farmer's market this Saturday. So that's an option if you want to do that. I think we've talked a little bit about like maybe season extension stuff. If people, I mean, you've kind of alluded to that already, but maybe there's more to say there. But I do want to give everyone a chance to ask at least one more question, and then I can chime in with additional questions if there's time.
Can I ask a question about, I was trying to copy the chat and it says it's disabled and won't let me do it.
Okay, I can get it at the end and email it out to everybody if that
If
would
you do
help.
that, that would be great.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
actually, Fern, I did want you to just double check, because I provided a link for the that BT worm and caterpillar killer, and I just want to make sure it's the one you had in mind, so I'm not promoting any unsafe chemicals.
Thank you for doing that, Mara, because that is very important. I'll check once we're off of this and I'll verify. And if I have a better link or something like that, I'll sub that in before Mara sends out the email. How does that sound?
Great. Perfect.
Perfect. All righty. So yes, let's hop around and see if anyone has any questions. And I just have to say, someone better ask me about garlic, because it is underrated. You don't have to do much at all. You get more garlic than you know what to do with. And it doesn't have to just grow in your garden bed. You can put it along your front sidewalk. You know, it's a very beautiful plant, and I think it adds some great height, even to maybe you know, a cut flower garden, or you know, tucked in with some hostas or something like that. So you know, if anyone is curious about garlic, let's talk about it. If no one here likes garlic, then I'm confused, is what I'll just say. Okay. Who doesn't cook with garlic? All right, so let's open it up and see if, hey, good to see you.
Hey, Fern, just a comment on that. Somewhere in, I think, Oregon, maybe. So the entire town once smelled like garlic, so they decided to make money off of it, and now they have an annual garlic fest.
Well, road trip, everyone. Echo, it's probably full of Italians. So yes, garlic, I mean, it is very easy to grow, and sort of like the garlic fest alludes to, once you grow one little clove of it, you know, you end up with more garlic, like I said, than you know what to do with. There's always enough to share. So I think it's also great for that reason. It's definitely something to celebrate, I would say. So yes, does anyone have a question that's come up about winterizing their garden? Vera, I see you raising your hand.
A few quick questions. So I just realized that I might have to cover my mint because mint has been another success. Of course, it's super easy to grow, but I have a lot of mint. And of course, after this call, I'm going to run into the garden and cut and try as much as possible for mint tea for winter. But like, how worried should I be about the mint now that the temperatures drop tonight? And the second question is that I would love to plant some native flowers for next spring. And I've learned that it now probably before the winter comes would be a cute time. So what can I grow and how? I have not been very successful. I bought different seeds last spring and nothing really grew. I didn't do much. I just put the seeds to the ground. But if there are any tips sort of for seeding native flowers that are good for pollinators at this time of the year, that'd be great. And of course, I'm also interested in the garlic instructions. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So let's first talk about mint. It may make it through this frost, it may not. It's one of those crops. My best advice to you for your mint plant would be to take an old bed sheet. If you don't have Agrabah, you can also use pillowcases. If you had, maybe a blanket you go camping with or something that you don't care too much about, then you can go ahead and put it outside tonight and lay it over the mint plant, and that should help insulate it. You can even just lay it over your whole raised bed if you wanted to, and that will help insulate it. Because it's sort of one of these may make it and may not make it plants, then, it's not too big of a deal if the cloth is touching your mint. Okay, that mostly pertains to these plants that are really sensitive to frost, like tomatoes and peppers. In those instances, whatever sort of row cover you're using, it's best to not have the row cover directly touching your plant, because the actual outside of the row cover will be whatever temperature it is, out in the world. And then underneath the row cover is where it's hopefully nice and toasty.
Okay. And so sorry to interrupt, because my tallest plant is probably the kale, so it's also the same for the kale. Like, it's fine, you can touch the kale. Okay.
Just a bed sheet over the garden bed, and it should be okay. And then let's see. So next question was wildflower seeds. Is that correct? Tricky question. How dare you? Okay, so let's see if I can answer this in a way that feels quick and eloquent. All right, so certain seeds, quick lesson.
You're going to talk about stratification or whatever?
I'm sorry. I have to. All right, so stratification is this process basically when, we're trying to mimic what happens to a seed once it falls from the plant. So in the case of certain seeds, they need to have essentially a mimicked winter in order for them to germinate come spring. A little bit confusing. This means they need to go through sort of wintry situations. They need to be frozen, they need to be wet, they need to be thawed, and they need to have this sort of expansion happen for them to really successfully germinate. So sometimes when you see those wildflower seed packets, it's a little bit of a scam. It's not a total scam. It's a little bit of a scam because oftentimes some of the seeds need stratification, meaning that you should plant them in the fall, and some of them don't, meaning that they're going to really be upset if you put them down in the garden in the fall and they go through winter time, right? They're spring ones that you should be planting. So what I would say is either elect to plant a bunch of wildflower seeds, a huge amount, because you're going to lose a large number of them to wind, erosion, and birds and squirrels, or opt to plant certain seeds that don't need to be stratified in the springtime, or purchase perennial seedlings and plant those. And those would be going in the springtime, okay, after risk of frost. The only times you'd really be planting those perennial seedlings, let's use the example of autumn sage or a salvia. Those plants, you're going to be planting them either in May or April pretty much, or in July, August, right? They need time in the warm soil for their roots to get down and strong before they encounter a frost, okay? And so if you choose to plant wildflower seeds right now, just plant a lot of them. All right, you're going to lose a lot of them over the winter time, like I said, to erosion, to wind, to them not being stratified perfectly, and to certain critters that see seeds on the ground and think, oh, thank you, you've scattered birdseed for me. So go ahead and plant a lot of them if you're going to. Okay, really overseed them. Last question was garlic. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you're just going to speak about it generally, so I said that I'm interested.
Thank you for that. I feel very supported right now. Thank you, Vera. All right, everyone, garlic is the best. I'm going to try to convert you all to growing garlic right now. All right, and this is why. It's a one-time purchase, and you have garlic for life. Okay, you're buying your beautiful garlic cloves. There are certain varieties you can buy. There are hard neck and soft neck varieties. Soft neck, you're typically going to find those in the grocery store. They don't have this sort of like soft, or they don't have a hard neck inside of them when you're taking apart the clove. I don't know if you've noticed before, but sometimes garlic has this really like rigid stalk inside of it. It is a little bit more mild in flavor, the soft neck. Sometimes the cloves are a little bit smaller, and it's not going to produce a scape, if any of you have had garlic scapes before. Then there's hard neck garlic that does have that little bit of a harder neck to it. It's hardier, so hard neck, hardier. It's more frost tolerant. Okay, so you might have better success rates with it, although really all garlic is sort of dig it and forget it. And it's also going to produce a scape. So you sort of get a 2-for-1 deal, if you will. So once you've made this initial purchase of seed garlic, and this is typically garlic that you're getting directly from a farmer rather than garlic at the grocery store. Certain garlic at the grocery store is not actually going to be plantable at your house. It's probably not fresh enough anyway, or treated kindly enough to actually grow. So like Mara said, you can get it at the farmer's market. Once you've purchased either your soft neck or your hard neck garlic, you can go ahead and plant it at this time of year. All right, so it wants to be planted when the soil is cold but not frozen, right? If you think about it, it wants to be planted when we humans can still dig in the soil, all right, before the soil is just a block of ice. And it wants to be planted pretty deep, I will say. So garlic loves a few things. It loves as much sun as you can give it in the wintertime. It loves nutrients, and it loves mulch, okay?
And Fern, may I interrupt for 1 second? Would you like me to follow up by sending them Fern's famous garlic preparation recipe?
Of course.
She has very specific instructions that I can share with you all that includes alcohol, not to drink, and other things. And yeah.
You can't use that actually. Anyway, so yes, so when planting garlic, it likes to be planted a minimum of 3 inches down into great soil. If your soil's not great, let's say you have really clay soil, cultivate to 8 inches down, okay? Meaning that you're loosening 8 inches worth of soil. You can drop that garlic clove in there from 3 inches pretty much down to, I'd say, 6 or 7 inches down into the soil itself, okay? It just needs a little bit of the soil loosened underneath it. It has very fragile roots, I will say, so that's why you're loosening what's underneath it. And if you can, put an all-purpose fertilizer inside the planting hole with the garlic. So that's a little bit about the depth. Once you have planted it, you can go ahead and cover it with about, let's see, depending on how deep you planted it, 4 to 8 inches of mulch, believe it or not. It likes mulch. The more mulch you give it, the bigger your garlic cloves are going to be, okay? And who doesn't love an absolutely beautiful large garlic clove? So go ahead and give it as much mulch as you can. If you don't have that much mulch on hand, be it straw mulch, shredded leaves, wood chips, then you can just sort of cheat by planting your garlic clove deeper. So if you only have 2 inches of mulch, plant your garlic clove, 6 inches deep in the soil. If you have 8 inches of mulch, you can get away with planting your garlic clove 3 inches deep in the soil. Does that sort of make sense? So there's a little bit of wiggle room regarding how much mulch you have on hand. Now, in terms of how to actually plant garlic, right? So the day of or the night before, you're going to want to go ahead and separate your garlic cloves, okay? Or garlic heads, and you're separating it into each of the individual cloves. Some people will swear that you need to leave the papery bits on. Some people will say that you need to remove the paper. It's fine either way. okay? Just don't take a knife to it or anything, but just, you can peel it, you know, separate it from the head. And then I typically leave the paper on if I can. I don't really have a good reason as to why. And what I do is I sanitize and fertilize, all right? If you don't want to sanitize, you can skip that step. It's more important for commercial growers. But sanitizing is the process of soaking your actual little individual garlic cloves in some sort of isopropyl alcohol or vodka or rubbing alcohol. Is that the same as isopropyl alcohol? Soaking in something that sanitizes the clove that's not bleach for about 10 minutes, all right? That's going to kill off any sort of diseases or bacteria that you'd have to be concerned about. Once you've done that, drain it, strain it, and then you can go ahead and soak it in a fertilizer. And you can do this up to overnight. If you do it much longer than overnight, you run the risk of the garlic clove really starting to grow roots. And again, garlic roots are very fragile. And I soak it typically in something that's sort of a water mixed with fish emulsion or kelp meal, bone meal, blood meal, really any of these sort of fertilizers. You can even use an all-purpose fertilizer. So soak your cloves in fertilizer if you can, and then do that planting process of digging them in the soil, apply a little bit of fertilizer to the hole, and then what you're gonna have throughout the winter and in the springtime and well into June of next year is just this beautiful plant, right? And that's why I say go ahead and put it, if you have sort of an ornamental garden that you're working with, or along your front, I always think it looks great along like a front sidewalk leading up to a house. Plant your garlic in there. You know, there's no real reason not to. I think it's wonderful. If you let it bloom, it's even great. It has a beautiful flower. If you have hardneck garlic, then there will be a scape, which is a flower head that's starting to form for you to harvest next spring. You can also harvest it early for green garlic if you want to, or you can wait until the head is perfectly formed under the ground. You'll know it's ready because the tops will start to die and brown. And you can go ahead and harvest it and cure it for about 2 weeks. And I think Mara and I made a video on curing garlic. And the reason this is great is because you can both cook with it in your own home, and then you never have to repurchase seeds. You have your garlic seed, you have your garlic inventory, your sort of family heirloom garlic ready for you to plant next year. So that's why you really only have to purchase it one time, right? And then you have it both for culinary and for gardening uses. I will say the other great thing about growing garlic, or really any sort of allium, is that insects that we don't want in our garden really hate it. They hate the smell of garlic. So if you have a huge insect problem, let's use cabbage loopers as an example. The smell of garlic in the soil, it really infuses the soil, keeps those pests at bay. They don't like it. I've gone as far as to crush garlic and leave it out on the counter for a few minutes, put it in a spray bottle and take it to someone's raised bed, and I've sprayed their raised bed with garlic water to mimic growing garlic, because the insects really don't like that smell in the soil. So it's also a great thing to plant if you have really severe issues with pests.
Downside, which I think you've touched on, but I just want to emphasize again, is that it will take real estate in your garden until late June, early July. And so if you have a small garden and you want to plant the types of plants that need to be planted earlier than that, like the tomatoes and the peppers and the squash, you're going to have to kind of pick between those if you don't get more creative and plant them in other areas. The other piece, so that's just something to keep in mind. And we've seen that sometimes, that then by the time we can plant in that place, in some of the gardens that we manage, it's hard to get things to really thrive there because it's so late in the season, depending on what you plant. And then the other issue is just making sure people have sufficient water, right, Fern?
You know, I haven't run into too many issues. If you can irrigate your garlic in the springtime, that's great. You really don't need to irrigate over the winter months, all right? You don't want to super heavily irrigate it, because if you think of it, you're kind of soaking that actual head of garlic, right? So what I would say is that garlic, if you want to plant it, you could do as much as to simply get some seed garlic, separate the cloves, stick it in the ground, put an inch or two of mulch on it, and set it and forget it. and it will still probably grow. It wants to grow, okay? You're not gonna have like the most culinary prize of garlic, you know, big, beautiful head, really even cloves or something next year, but you'll still have a garlic head to work with most likely, okay? Now, if you do these steps, you sanitize, you fertilize, and then, you know, you make sure that the soil has a lot of mulch on top of it, then you're probably going to have a prize-worthy head of garlic waiting for you, or however many heads of garlic you plant waiting for you next summer. And I just want to touch on the fact that Mara mentioned, yes, so it does take up garden real estate really into like the peak of the season, if you will. I would say when in doubt, plant bush beans after it. Bush beans take about 50 to 65 days for them to be ready. So typically you can still get a yield of bush beans, which are, you know, the prize of summer, before you have a frost in the autumn. Okay, that was my garlic spiel. I want to open it up, and Mara will send out the SOP on planting garlic for anyone who's curious. Share it with your friends. Make everyone plant garlic. It's good for the world. And then let's see if anyone has any other questions about winterizing.
Karen and Gabe or Maggie, do you guys have questions?
I just love for you to do an overall closing the garden thing, if you're willing. I mean, I can ask specific questions, but it's up to, it's really, I mean, I have raised beds and a patio bed that's fairly, and they're very different. And I usually just put some mushroom compost in and then cover them with straw.
Lovely.
But I haven't done any I haven't done any nitrogen fixing per se.
Okay, that's great to know. So yes, I'd be happy to talk about putting your garden bed to bed. So let's do sort of my winterizing ground rules, if you will. The first thing is if you have irrigation, get it blown out. All right, so if you have any sort of irrigation, if it's hooked up to your spigot or if it's connected to the rest of your landscaping irrigation, that should be addressed, right? We don't want to have any really expensive leaks in your house or in the irrigation. Okay.
Actually, has everyone done that?
Mine is next, is Monday, gets shut out Monday.
Okay.
We
Be
didn't
fine.
do the tiny black tubes that go into the garden, just assuming that we could just pull those out next year. And we didn't do even the big tube going to it. So is it
The main line? So
Yeah,
have you taken your timer off, Gabe?
Yeah,
Okay.
we just connected it from the hose.
Okay, that's great. So at that point, it's not going to kill anything in your house. You're not going to have to call a plumber. So I think you're okay. If it's connected to a bigger system or if it's somehow connected to your house, the things we're most concerned about are backflow, cracking your spigot, and then the long-term longevity of the actual black pipes that you have in your garden. So you should be okay. It's not going to kill anything that the actual little pipes haven't been blown out. So if you have irrigation, if you have a timer that is not frost proof, bring that in. And if you have irrigation connected to your house or any other irrigation, blow it out. Let's see, the next step, like I said, would be addressing the warm season versus cold season versus perennial crops. Okay, so tending to all of those. If you're going to chop and drop your warm season, that's great. If you're going to leave any sort of cold season crops to see how they fare, then that's great as well. And in general, you really don't have to mess with your perennials until they've gone dormant in December, January, February. Okay, so not too much to do when it comes to that. All right.
What would you do when they go dormant?
So certain perennials, and it really depends because so many things are perennials, like to be pruned. Some of them like to be pruned all the way back to their crown where they're growing out of the earth. Some of them, like certain raspberries, don't want to be pruned at all. So depending on your perennials and what you've really done to date, you can sort of replicate that. If you've planted any new perennials, then it is worth looking into proper pruning techniques for the winter time. Typically though, pruning is not going to happen, like I said, until the plant is totally dormant, it's asleep, and it's really not going, it's like it's under anesthesia. It's not going to feel you lop off one of its limbs or something like that. Okay, not to be weird about it, but anyway.
Well, and some perennials provide food over the winter.
Yes, so important. And
Yeah.
even some not perennials, sunflowers as an example.
Yes.
Too many people are cutting down their sunflowers. leave them for the birds. Those are sunflower seeds, right? Sedum is another great example, very common ground cover. I leave those little brown, dried, sort of dead flower heads because those are all just providing forage and habitat for wonderful creatures in the wintertime. So when in doubt, if it's got seeds, you can leave it, right?
Like rudbeckia looks like it should be left just because they're so.
Yes, absolutely. Leave the rudbeckia if you can, and deadhead come springtime so that the new growth can get through. And that is the case with most of those flowers. You know, let's use echinacea as an example as well. Any of these sort of seedy flowers are going to be wonderful for the birds. If you have something that's not super seedy, autumn sage, again, being an example, then there's really no need to leave a flimsy, tiny flower for the birds. But leave what you can in terms of habitat. Now, tomatoes, peppers, they're going to melt, essentially. They're going to rot. So they aren't going to be standing as habitat in the field for birds. So go ahead and remove those warm season crops. And then no matter your garden, no matter if you're growing in ground, in a raised bed, in a patio pot, too many people have heard me say this, but there's this group I love. They're called the Practical Farmers of Iowa, which some people here have heard me say this 20 times, which also, what a name, the Practical Farmers, just such a, I don't know, an adequate name. They have a slogan, which would be, don't farm naked, cover crop. Some other people would say that nature is modest, cover up. Like there are little sayings all trying to allude to the fact that bare soil is not a great thing and it never really happens in nature, right? Other than in where humans are messing around, soil is not bare. Something's growing on it, be it lichen or a mulch or leaf litter or whatever it may be. So what I would recommend is covering your soil. Now you can do this through a few different avenues. You can cover crop, you can mulch, and compost, I would say, falls underneath the mulching category, so you're aware. Now you can cover crop into a compost, which is sort of a fun way to do both. But anyway, so cover cropping would be growing something that you're probably not going to be consuming, but instead you're growing it so that it's either replenishing your soil now through nitrogen like clover, or it's going to be replenishing the soil in the springtime when you return the organic matter into the soil, when you put it back onto the soil or into the soil. Mulching would be the application of compost or wood chips or straw, shredded leaves, all these things we've sort of alluded to. So no matter how you choose to do it, just try to cover your soil, okay? So that it isn't naked. And then it's really your choice what you do from there. You know, if you're wanting to sheet mulch, you can sheet mulch. If you're wanting to grow crops throughout the winter months, you can do that as well. So there are a lot of things you can do with the winter garden. I always try to remind people this is not a period of hibernation as much as it is a period of incubation, okay? So the soil is not doing nothing in the wintertime. The garden's not doing nothing. It's not just out there dormant, right? It is preparing. It's going through this really necessary cycle, right? It's killing off certain diseases, the frosts are. Interrupting pest life cycles, these frosts. So go ahead and lean into the incubation of your garden. You know, start thinking now about what you're wanting out of your garden next year, and then sort of choose wisely based on, you know, what you do to prepare for that, I would say. Does that make sense, Maggie?
Yes, totally.
Wonderful.
Yes, totally.
If
You
people
hear
are
something in the
putting, oh, sorry, go ahead, Maggie.
You can hear anything in the background. It's laying out in a big basket on flat the 80 some green tomatoes
Oh.
to go through the recipe.
That's awesome. So you'll have to send us a picture. The one thing I would say, Fern, so I know at Boundless Landscapes, when we are preparing folks' gardens for the winter, we generally do 2 inches of compost as like a bare minimum of what we're going to do to prepare gardens for the winter. Is that your recommendation?
Absolutely. And if you're not doing that, you're losing fertility. All right, so there's a very thin line, and this is something that's talked about so much, between regenerating soil and degenerating. What would that be? Degenerating soil? What would be that? What was it?
Degrading, maybe?
Degrading? I think it's degrading. Although maybe I'll just make a new word, Mara. It's degenerating.
It's the thing.
Degenerative agriculture. Anyway, all right. So So if you are regenerating soil, you're not just replenishing it, but you are adding to it, both in terms of organic matter, which is what's going to be providing nutrients, soil retention, minerals to your soil, or moisture retention and minerals to the soil and habitat, or you are taking away from those nutrients. You're using the organic matter. You're depleting. It's losing these nutrients to the atmosphere or to crops like tomatoes, which mine a lot of nutrients. They're heavy feeders from the garden. So we want to do whenever we can, whatever we can to regenerate the soil through responsible practices. And one of those, I would say the standard, if you're growing heirloom crop, or not heirloom, annual crops, okay? If you're growing most vegetables, then you're gonna need to be adding compost. And that is a minimum of 2 inches in the fall. Ideally, it's 2 inches in the fall, 2 inches in the spring, believe it or not, which you might do the math and start thinking, this is a lot of compost bought from the store. This is a lot of, bags, cubic feet worth of compost that you're purchasing. But it's really sort of the cost of growing in this sort of way. There are other things you can do. You can chop and drop to return that actual organic matter of the vegetables to the garden. You can plant certain crops like comfrey, which provide immense amounts of organic matter that can be chopped and dropped and laid down as sort of a green mulch that decompose and add a lot of great nutrients. You can add in sort of supplemental cover crops like clover, which are nitrogen fixers. So these things all sort of replenish the soil. But if you're not adding a good quality compost, I sound a little bit, I don't know if any of you ever watched Ina Garten and Barefoot Contessa on Food Network.
Yes.
But she always said when she was cooking, good vanilla. She would say, use whatever else you want, but good vanilla. In growing vegetables, it's sort of good compost, okay? That's what we really are gonna wanna be splurging on. And if you're using good compost, then you are replenishing all of these little minerals. You're replenishing the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium into the soil. And you are also going to just be adding to the overall health of that ecosystem rather than taking away from it, which is what annual vegetables do tend to do. Vera? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Fern. I'm a little confused because I think I'm looking at my notes from our consulting session, and I think you said that for perennials I should not put any, but I have a garden bed where I have both.
Yes.
So how to handle that?
A really good question. So when in doubt, if you have both mixed in, which a lot of people do, myself included, then go ahead and add it. All right. What you want to be hesitant about is adding any sort of fertilizer to a perennial at this time of year. And that is because you may accidentally kickstart a bunch of growth that's tender and really susceptible to frost. And compost is a little bit of a fertilizer in many ways. It tends to be a little bit heavier in nitrogen, especially if it's a manure-based composted product. So you want to be a little bit more careful, but when in doubt, add compost. Vera, if you want to be very careful, you can sprinkle the compost in the garden where you had the annuals, and then in the springtime, that's when you load on extra compost, right? But we're wanting to add this compost in to replenish specifically what the annual vegetables took. If you planted tomatoes, if you planted squash of any sort, pumpkins, cucumbers, if you planted zucchini, if you planted peppers, corn, these crops take a lot. Oh, we have a guest in the background. Kat, thank you for your contributions. Wonderful, Kat. So you're going to want to be adding some compost back in to just really replenish what those annual vegetables took. It's not as important if you have a little section of your garden that maybe are some perennials that are pretty low key, right? Maybe you have some Russian sage growing or some rudbeckia. Then these aren't mining from the soil in the same way. And what they often do as well is decompose right in place and then return next year, decompose in place and return next year. So they are sort of composting themselves a little bit, okay? They're replenishing themselves. So since our annual crops usually aren't doing that, we really need to add in something that's going to keep that soil fertility high and keep the organic matter of the actual soil sufficient. I am concerned we might witness a cat catch a fish. Sorry, I just, oh, let's hope that does not happen on camera. Vera, does that fully answer your question?
You did. Thank you. That's great. Thank
Of
you.
course.
Karen, did you guys have another question over there?
It was Gabriel's kind of obsessed about that. He's got a pumpkin, it got this big. So I was just going to pull that for him from what you said earlier. But my question is, I guess back to the zinnias, they have all those beautiful seeds on there. You think I should leave them for the birds, or should I just drop them down so that they can regenerate next year? Is that part of the stratification? I'm conflicted.
Very good question. So zinnias are not a perennial. Okay, so they're not frost tolerant. So they're not going to be doing the same thing as, let's say, a coneflower. Okay, I would leave them though. And this is why. You do have the chance that the fully formed mature zinnia seeds for some reason make it through the year and volunteer next year. All right, so that does occasionally happen, even though I do not believe zinnia need any form of stratification, and I do not believe the seeds are necessarily frost tolerant. Okay, you would typically want to harvest all of your zinnia seed heads if you were a seed breeder from the field prior to any sort of frost or any sort of moisture event, because they are very susceptible to powdery mildew. That said, that doesn't mean that birds won't come and eat them. And that doesn't mean that miracles don't happen in the garden, because really we have so many little microclimates that we're working with that they do. So you may accidentally have so many random zinnias next year, believe it or not. And if you don't chop them down, then the worst thing that happened was that they sort of decomposed in place and the birds got a snack.
Wondering if, so we have about 11 minutes left, and I'm wondering if we should do a speed round of people asking questions and you giving sort of briefer answers if there are still outstanding questions.
I have one. You know, when you're talking about planting clover or winter rye or whatever,
Yes.
do you just turn it over into the soil in the spring?
Great question. So cover crop termination, let's talk
Yeah.
about.
I haven't done it before because of that. I hadn't answered that question for myself.
Yes, and it really depends. So just so you know, commercial growers would most likely either terminate their cover crop through crimping or tilling it back into the soil.
Right. But not a regenerative farmer wouldn't, right? Would they?
Well, a regenerative farmer who's not no-till still would probably till it back into the soil.
So shallowly, just do a shallow till. Is that what you mean?
Shallow till, perhaps a tilth maybe, or they would have it grazed down and then tilthed in. Or mowed down. In the home garden, I love cover crops, and I think they're underrated because we have the flexibility of not being dependent upon any sort of specific machinery doing this for us.
Right.
So we have so much flexibility in how we terminate cover crops, truly.
Right.
There's so much you could do. And heck, if you wanted to harvest your winter rye and bake a loaf of rye bread, you have the flexibility to do that, believe it or not. You might only bake half a loaf of bread based on how much rye you're actually harvesting. But anyway, so terminating cover crops, especially winter ones. In the springtime, you know, I will say termination for clover is harder. Clover is one of those crops that doesn't always terminate perfectly. Karen is witnessing this, and here's what I'll say. That's too bad. Sorry, it's great for the earth. You know?
And sometimes you like to not terminate it, Fern. You like to plant it in all the walkways.
I love it planted in walkways if you have an in-ground plot, and I just sort of hand weed it out. I love it in replace of lawn. I love it in so many applications. I mean, they're little flowers, and occasionally you get a 4-leaf clover. What's not to love? They also fix nitrogen. Pollinators love it, and insects, really beneficial ones, especially, crawl through it and make homes out of it. So it's just sort of a wonderful thing to have around. Rye, which is perhaps my favorite winter cover crop, partially due to its just vigor, you know, and that includes winter rye, winter wheat, and then triticale, which is the hybridization of the two. These crops put on a massive amount of organic matter, and they have these roots that you can hand yank out yourself. So
right.
What I elect to do, if you're going to be planting a cover crop, and if it's rye or wheat or triticale, I plant it in the springtime. I yank it out. I knock the soil off of the shallow roots, and I lay it on its side. And what you have is the most perfect straw for planting into.
Oh, great idea. Yeah.
It decomposes in place into this sort of straw-like material. Oftentimes it's about 6 feet tall, which is often the length of many people's raised beds. So it's just sort of like this wonderful cover cropping sort of straw-like sheet that you can lay over the beds. So I think rye is great for that reason. If you wanted to, you could till it back in. You could, but I don't know many people who elect to hand till a raised bed. So I think terminating it by pulling it out and laying on its side is great. Some people also crimp it, which essentially is like a fatal sort of bend to the rye, and after that point it can't regrow itself. So you can crimp it and you just sort of snap the stem and lay it on its side. You leave the roots in place then. That's absolutely fine as well. So you have flexibility in how you choose to terminate these.
The important, maybe I missed this, but the important thing is to do it before it goes to seed, right?
To do it before it goes to seed, exactly, or else you'll have a reseeding sort of winter rye situation throughout the summertime. And you'll know when it's gone to seed because it's going to have these dry brown seed heads on it that look, you know, like traditional wheat, as compared to, you know, sort of if they are still that beautiful sort of silvery green or silvery blue, then the seeds are not mature and they should not germinate. So you can go ahead and terminate it even if a seed head is formed, but it is going to be viable seed if it is brown and sort of crinkly.
So do you have to water it or do you just expect the natural moisture of the winter?
I would never water a cover crop in the winter if I could help
Good.
it. Really, it's something that is similar to garlic where you set it and forget it. It grows when it can. It puts on a lot of height in the springtime, especially when we get those heavier snows.
Yeah.
And I must say that rye is absolutely beautiful. If you have a larger in-ground plot and you have the ability to plant rye, it just is this beautiful sort of silvery thing flowing in the wind. So it's a very opportune grower. It's very hardy. And I think it's a great thing to plant for a winter cover crop.
Can you get it in small amounts? Since I would probably do it in my raised beds, but I'd do it in the Veggie. Oh yeah. And
Or
just
I'll do some.
I have some extra, Maggie. It's our last year, so you might have to plant a little heavier, but I don't think I'm going to need it all this year. So if anyone does want it, we can arrange for a handoff.
oh, that would be terrific because I'd love to try it. And in that bed, which I've been working on for years, it started out to be the previous owner's hot tub. It's been removed, and then I've, you know, it's starting to get really rich, but it still needs.
Yes.
It's got clay in it, whereas the raised beds obviously have none.
Yes. So yes, rye is a great option for that. Karen, did you have a question?
Yeah, so the clover that we did rip out, should we replant clover now for the part that we ripped out?
It's your call. You can, and what I'll say is clover spreads. So you might be surprised, and even if you don't pull it out, it still might come back. You can seed it. You could also just wait and see what happens and utilize a mulch or something like that.
So do you mulch over the rye?
You can, believe it or not, and it is opportune in that way. What I will say though is if you're going to be applying any sort of wood chips or something, do it maybe more sparse than you normally would.
Or
But what I would recommend is put down about 2 inches of good quality compost. Like you said, a mushroom compost is great. And then seed the rye heavily into it. And you seed rye pretty heavily, almost similar to how some people would seed maybe arugula or grass seed even, because grass. And then you're going to go ahead and see little tiny grasses start to form, and they'll grow opportunistically throughout the winter months. And if you did plant them into a compost, then you're probably going to have pretty vigorous rye growing.
oh, cool.
Fern, if you plant clover, do you need to inoculate it?
Okay, that's a great question, and it depends on, I had to think of the answer for a second, sorry. Yes, it depends on where the heck you got your seeds, actually, believe it or not. Many seed companies sell pre-inoculated clover seeds. Some companies do not, and this is especially true if they also sell the inoculant, because you have to buy both. So
You need to explain what that is quickly, but
yes, so the inoculant is a beneficial bacteria or a rhizome. No, it's a bacteria. It's a bacteria, I think. I have some about 20 feet away from me that you can put in the soil. And once it's present in your soil, you don't need to add it again. Oh, Mara's got some. Great. So there are certain inoculants for certain nitrogen fixers. There's one specifically for clover. There's another one that's for like veg. I'm forgetting, but field peas maybe. And it is a bacteria that I think it's a bacteria that once it's present in the soil, like I said, you don't need to replenish it, and it interacts with the roots of the clover plant, little rhizonodules that then fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into a usable nitrogen for the plants. Sometimes in native ecosystems, so if you're growing in ground in the earth, that bacteria, I believe it's a bacteria, is already present. So you do not need to inoculate, and occasionally seeds are pre-inoculated. Oftentimes, really responsible nurseries, let's use Harlequins as an example. I believe they pre-inoculate any of their nitrogen fixing perennials, so that if they have nitrogen fixing capacity, that soil is pre-inoculated, so that once you put that plant in the ground, it's already, you know, a bit able to fix nitrogen. Does that make sense? It's sort of like a complex topic. If you want to find the inoculant to be safer rather than sorry, then I believe Johnny Seeds sells that Endure inoculant online, and it's quite affordable. And like I said, it is a one-time purchase.
Just in terms of timing, even though we're getting this frost now, like at Boundless Landscapes, we're planning to add those layers of compost and do that planting and plant the garlic on like October 28th, because by then we're assuming all of those warm weather crops will be kaput, though who knows, it looks quite lovely. And it's not too late still to plant those things.
Right.
Is it too late to ask one quick question? We're out of time. Have 1 minute.
Yeah, one last question I think is all we have time for, and then oh my gosh, we've spent an hour and a half together. It's amazing. Time flies.
Thank you. So Fern, like I actually did take the strawberries out of the extra strawberries that I had, and I put them into a pot. And now I'm like wondering, like, what should I do with that pot? Like, do I need to put mulch on the top as well, or should I move it indoors? Like, what's happening with strawberries now?
That's a really good question, Vera. So what happened was Vera had strawberries. They produced little baby runners. They were taking over Vera's whole raised bed. So she went ahead and separated those runners, and now she has baby strawberries that are growing in their own little pots. Straw or wood chips, go ahead and, you know, if you want to, go ahead and apply a mulch like straw or wood chips to them, so they have some thermal mass. Leave the pots outside, don't bring them inside or anything like that. And then in the springtime, they're going to want some compost from you if you can. I believe strawberries like acidic soil, slightly acidic soil. So if you have maybe a more acidic compost, and oftentimes they'll say compost for strawberries or compost for tomatoes, which are plants that like this sort of acidic soil, you can go ahead and purchase that. That's actually going to assist in the flavor of the actual strawberries themselves, having that little bit of acidic compost with them. So give them that compost in the springtime, and then you're going to have some wonderful baby strawberry plants, hopefully for you next spring. And then you'll have strawberry baby plants for everyone next winter, right?
Thank you so much.
That's great.
Oh shoot, sorry. I think we're. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Fern.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I think that's a lovely question to end on, because it's really looking forward to sort of sweetness of spring, right? Strawberries, nothing better in the springtime. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for spending a whole hour and a half of your Thursday night with me. It's been a real joy.